Namaskar, very good morning to all the distinguished scholars, respected faculty members, esteemed participants, colleagues, students and friends. Suprabhatam to every one of you joining from across Bharat and beyond. It is both an honor and a privilege for me to address this gathering that has assembled here today around a theme that is, I think, at once scholarly, civilizational, but also deeply contemporary. And I'd like to commend the organizers for coming up with such a wonderful title, India is Bharat, Epistemic Disobedience and the Pursuit of Indigenous Knowledge Systems. I think the title itself invites a lot of quiet reflection. It compels us to move beyond the merely political or constitutional understanding of India and engages with a much deeper question. How do we know what we know? And perhaps even more importantly, who has determined the legitimacy of that knowledge? For centuries, societies across the world lived according to a very diverse system of understanding reality. Different civilizations, they developed their own methods of inquiry, their own philosophies of nature to understand its various vagaries, their own conceptions of what time was, what memory was, what are ethics and so on. Yet, with the rise of the European colonial expansion, it was only one particular worldview that gradually began to acquire the power to define not only itself as not just as one among many, but almost as the universal standard against which all other ways of knowledge would be judged. And colonialism was therefore never just a political or economic project. As colonialism, I've always held, comes with three dimensions: the political capture, as in the case of Bharat, you had a island which was thousands of kilometers away, managed to subjugate us for more than 2 centuries. There was economic exploitation too, where raw materials from different parts of India would be bought at low prices and taken back to the mills in, say, Manchester and made wonderful textiles, which would then come back to India and destroy the local markets. So the political and economic dimensions are there, and it is sometimes possible to get rid of these after a protracted struggle, like in the case of our country, where we've had a long march, a fight to freedom, both through violent and non-violent means, to achieve it in 1947. Economic progress today, after 80 years after freedom, we have surpassed our colonial master Britain in terms of the size of our economy. So these are still, after a lot of effort, one could achieve to shed the shackles of political or economic colonialism. But I think the third dimension, which is the more lasting and the more pernicious kind of dimension of colonialism, is the capture of the mind. Because remember, colonialism was also an epistemological project where the geographical invasion was always accompanied by the control of local knowledge, of identity and of the mind. And a quote that is often attributed to the English novelist George Orwell says that almost a certain way of destroying a civilization or a people is to obliterate their own understanding of their own history. And that's exactly what's happened with India in these long centuries of colonialism. Lands were mapped, peoples were classified according to the standards that they put, traditions were catalogued, and histories were rewritten to suit whoever was in power. And I think what happened in the process is colonized societies were often persuaded that their knowledge systems were inadequate, irrational, or sometimes even obsolete. And the most enduring consequence of colonial rule was not simply foreign administration, but that internalization of intellectual dependency. And I'm sure the the irony is not lost on me and all of you either, that we are having this entire discussion and this seminar and my own keynote address in the language of the colonizer. Though we've indigenized English so much, and I'm aware that I'm also talking to the English department of the Gurucharan University, but at the end of the day, it is the language that our colonial masters spoke and wanted us to think in. So there are ironies at multiple levels here. But even after political independence, many former colonies continue to inherit all the frameworks through which they interpreted themselves coming from their earlier rulers. Institutions just changed hands, but often the assumptions that underlay them remained remarkably intact. And India was no exception, and hence we still retain, I think, the term post-colonial in academic circles. The 19th and the 20th centuries witnessed tremendous intellectual transformations. Colonial education policies created a class of intermediaries who increasingly interpreted India through categories that were developed elsewhere. Now, this process had many benefits, of course, including exposure to global intellectual currents, the latest scientific developments, and the modern political thoughts that were brewing at that time in various parts of the world. Yet, I think it also produced a very, very subtle estrangement from indigenous knowledge frameworks. And the net effect of all of this was that Bharat was more often studied than lived as a civilizational continuum. Mind you, we are the only pre-Bronze Age era civilization that is still alive and kicking. And there must be some merit to that resilience of continuum that we've managed to maintain despite so many odds. Ancient texts were more likely by our colonial masters and their intellectual successors likely to be treated as storehouses of mythology than as complex intellectual traditions that needed a very careful intervention and a very unique individualistic intervention. Local ecological wisdom, all of this is dismissed as folklore or some tribal mumbo jumbo rather than as environmental knowledge. Oral traditions are almost always deprioritized when compared to written archives. So indigenous categories were often also translated into foreign conceptual vocabularies that only partially captured their meaning. I mean, a language like Sanskrit, where every word perhaps can have multiple meanings depending on the context in which it is used, to have a Westerner translate it either with malicious intentions or just ignorance of the language could lead to such catastrophic interpretations. And that's exactly how not only Indian knowledge systems, but I think our historical discourse too has been riddled with in the last several decades, I must say. So, consider the example of the river, say, Ganga, and compare it with the English term that is often used, Ganges. Ma, Ganga, and the whole imagery that builds, and the very sterile kind of name of the Ganges. So even if the terms are actually synonymous, is there any kind of a psycho-spiritual correlation between them? No, right? And that's exactly what happens when we come to put Western frameworks on a lot of Indian, epistemological frameworks. And today, as part of this wonderful 3-day seminar that we have, I think we're all gathered to speak about a very interesting term that the organizers of this symposium have framed: epistemic disobedience. But here, I don't think any one of us, at least of all me or my organization, the Foundation for Indian Historical and Cultural Research, FIHCR, which is extremely proud and happy to partner with Gurucharan University on this important symposium, are advocating the rejection of modern knowledge. Nor are we proposing a kind of an isolationist, retreat from global intellectual exchange. Rather, what we are asking is a very fundamental question. Can India participate in global knowledge production without first regaining confidence in its own intellectual traditions? And I believe that answer to that question must be a very, very emphatic yes. Now, this expression epistemic disobedience may sound very radical, revolutionary almost, but at its heart lies a very, very simple proposition in my view. It is the refusal, a dogged kind of refusal to accept that knowledge flows unidirectionally. It is a recognition that humanity's intellectual heritage is pluralistic rather than singular. It is, the claim that different traditions of inquiry can actually coexist. They can converse with each other and actually enrich each other. And any, perusal of human history would show that. That in isolationist, cocoons, cultures and traditions have never survived. So such a conversation has a very, particularly compelling basis when it comes to India's very rich civilizational experience. Now, world over, there are frameworks for these, as all of you scholars and participants of a seminar of this, importance are, I'm sure, well aware of. We in India, I think, would stand to gain immensely from just understanding the entire process and the experience of these, experiments, because it's never too nice to keep reinventing the wheel. The philosophers and scholars who gave us this, what is now touted very often, decolonial framework or approach, are Aníbal Quijano, Walter Minolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres. They were all writing primarily from Latin America. They were watching a continent which was trying to emerge from the shadow of Europe, only to discover that the shadow had been actually deeply internalized. That the universities taught European social science, that the newspapers were written in the language of the colonizer. Even the revolutionary movements, adopted the categories Marxism and liberalism, nationalism. All of this too had been mined in European furnaces. It had nothing indigenous about it. So an India story is different in its texture, but not so much in its structure. So consider this: when the English East India Company began its long project of political subjugation and administrative control and consolidation, it just didn't tax our land or kill local industries or through subsidiary alliances gobble up princely states. It began to understand, learn and classify our knowledge. They decided what was superstition and what was science, what was regressive and what was modern, again all in quotes, modern and progressive. It would look perhaps at the Charak Samhita and say, oh, this is just primitive medicine, mumbo jumbo. It probably looked at the Arthashastra and saw cunning oriental despotism, not a very sophisticated treatise on statecraft. It looked at the Panchatantra and saw some fairy tales for children, not some kind of a philosophical system of political and social ethics that had deeply influenced governance right from Persia to medieval Europe. And while saying all of this, I also want to caveat it with the fact that we owe also quite a bit to our colonizing masters, because many of these discoveries, many of the archaeological finds, even the entire discovery of the Brahmi or the Kharoshti scripts, the establishment of the Archaeological Survey of India, all of that was done by several of these, Orientalists, the early, scholars from Britain, who were also very fascinated by the Eastern mind and wanted to learn more about it. But then there was also another class, and the person who probably best typifies that is the much hated Thomas Macaulay, whose infamous Minutes of 1835, I think that delivered the final and decisive blow, not with a canon but actually with a curriculum. And all of you are well aware of his minute, where he says very clearly that the whole objective of English education is to create a vast group of interpreters between us, the British, and the millions whom we govern, who are only Indian in their blood and skin color, but they are British in their tastes, opinions, in their moral and their intellect. And of course, his famous declaration where he said a single shelf of a good European library was not was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. This was not an argument. It was not, looking for any kind of comparative scholarship. It was almost a declaration of epistemic conquest. It said your ways of thinking do not really count. Your languages are vehicles of backwardness. Your texts are just superstitions and curiosities. They can't be authoritative, treatises of any kind of knowledge. And the tragedy is not that Macaulay said this. Conquerors have always sought to devalue what they conquer. It's the oldest justification for conquest. After all, the greater tragedy is that we Indians actually believed him, and somewhere subliminally, I think a lot of us educated folks too continue to somewhere believe this. And the post-independence era should have been that moment of reckoning. Maps changed, flags changed, streets were renamed, but the deeper architecture of knowledge, what counted as rigorous, what counted as modern, scientific, rational, I think that remained remarkably intact as what we had bequeathed. Our universities continue to teach sociology through Weber and Durkheim. Our economics departments taught Adam Smith and Keynes much more, not perhaps Kautilya's sophisticated analysis of market failure or state intervention or a kind of a state control. Our literary canons, I think, continue to celebrate the English novel, Shakespeare's works, Yeats, and nothing wrong. Everyone, these are great universal gems of knowledge and should be appreciated everywhere. But while our own extraordinary bhasha traditions, children in the country probably are so less aware of the works of Kalidasa and the lyrical, the poetic beauty, the imagery used there, the poems of Laldev, the mystic from Kashmir, to Shankar Dev in Assam, to Annamacharya in Andhra, to the Kannada Vachanakara and the Haridasa poets, the Maithili compositions of Vidyapati, the Tamil Sangam corpus. All of these gets relegated to regional literature departments. And that is what the concept note for this seminar, I think, rightly identifies as the persistence of colonial epistemology, not through foreign administrators, but through our own inherited categories of what constitutes legitimate knowledge. The colonizer left, but I think the coloniality stayed back. And in the process, what are some of the things that we have lost? The Indian knowledge ecosystem always evolved through extraordinary diversity, while many cultures preserve their intellectual traditions in centralized institutions. In India, philosophical schools constantly debated one another for centuries. And debate, discussion, dissent, differences of opinion was the bedrock of this country, which proudly claims to also, and rightly so, be the mother of democracy. And the classical example is the intellectual duel between Adi Shankaracharya of a Vedanta Darshana and Mandana Mishra of a Mimamsa Darshana, two Astika panthas within the Shad Darshanas of the orthodox schools, actually having such intellectual dissonance with each other. But Shankara's Digvijaya comes not by cutting off your opponent's head, but actually by subjugating them by the power of your argument, by the power of your intellect. And I think that is the the foundational element of all Indian knowledge systems. Mathematicians, poets, grammarians, astronomers, physicians, artisans, agricultural communities, tribal societies, monastic institutions, everyone, I think, contributed to this process of creation and transmission of knowledge. And the very structure of Indian thought has always been dialogical. The Upanishadic traditions thrived always on questioning. I often quote this, our earliest text, the Rig Veda, it has the famous Nasadiya Sukta, which I'm sure a lot of you would know about, where instead of affirming that God created the universe on the first day, on the third day and fifth day and all of these which many Abrahamic faiths do, What does the Nasadiya Sukta say? It first of all says, oh, of course, there's a great, universe that's been created, and the ruler, the head of this entire universe sits in some mighty heavens above all of us. He controls everything. He is the one who is created all of it. But then it also ends with a sense of doubt. It asks very poignantly, does he really know that it is he who created it? Do any one of us know that something like him exists? Some supreme power which sits in a mighty heaven somewhere, like an adhyaksh, like a leader who is controlling all the puppets like a grand puppeteer. And just imagine the level of heresy and blasphemy this could cause in an Abrahamic setting, where you're questioning the very veracity, the validity of the supreme creator, and says even he doesn't know. Does he even exist? Who knows whether he knows or not? I mean, this constant questioning, where we are not a country of believers, but we are a country of seekers. And so even atheism or constant disbelief and not conforming to specific pigeonholes or belief systems is so much an ingrained part of what Indian philosophy and Indian knowledge is. And this concept, I think, constantly also informs all our knowledge systems. Now, the Buddhist tradition to institutionalize debate, right? You had the Nyaya school, which further refined methods of logic, of inference. You had the Mimamsa school, which explored hermeneutics. Ayurveda, which developed very sophisticated frameworks for understanding health and ecology. The mathematical and astronomical traditions, which produced that insights that traveled across continents. And that's not just some eulogization, but it's a fact of history. The mathematical and astronomical literature that India produced inspired other regions too. Regional cultures within different parts of this vast subcontinent also generated their own rich systems of memory, of practice. And what is remarkable is not merely the existence of these traditions, but also their ability to coexist despite profound differences. So, I mean, a lot of people talk about this whole Buddhism being snuffed out of India and so on, applying once again a very, very Western and, dare you say, an Abrahamic lens to how differences in philosophy were dealt with this country. It was never through force. A stray incident here and there of some ruler or somebody who is anyway never glorified and celebrated by successive generations, that could be individual aberrations, but there was never a theological sanction for snuffing out a different viewpoint. And that is, I think, extremely important for us as Bharatiyas today, who are so deeply ingrained into this whole Indian knowledge systems, to ingrain within ourselves that this is our strength and this is something we should not give up today when we try to monochromatize things and homogenize everything into one, which has not been. This pluralism remains one of Bharat's greatest intellectual gifts, not only to this country, but I think the whole of humanity. Yet, I think much of this inheritance remains very insufficiently studied, inadequately documented, or very, very poorly integrated into any kind of contemporary academic discourse. And I'm talking to a bunch of academicians and budding scholars. And so the challenge before us is not just out of nostalgia, and feel that, it's those glory days, but one of recovery. And recovery actually requires rigorous scholarship. You need to get down and dirty your hands. And it also requires evidence. It requires intellectual honesty of articulation. So all of this is important. But here I would also like to caution all of you, well-informed, erudite scholars, that we need to avoid two extremes. The first is this colonial habit of dismissing indigenous traditions as inherently inferior, which I'm sure none of us here are doing. The second is the temptation, and it is I can understand where it comes from, because we are all coming, as I said, from this position of nostalgia, of recovering something which we feel is in the verge of destruction. So the emotion that is attached to it is high, and I do understand and acknowledge it. But the temptation to romanticize every aspect of the past as being perfect and beyond criticism, I think that is something that we must avoid. Because I want to be very precise here, the project of epistemic disobedience is very easily, it can be misunderstood, and when it is misunderstood, it can very easily also get caricatured. It is not, and not in caps, a project of nativism. It is not a call to reject everything Western as being contaminated or bad and predatory, or to pretend that knowledge systems itself, they exist in hermeneutically sealed civilizational containers, all separate from each other. The extraordinary thing about the Bharatiya intellectual traditions, right from Nagarjuna, Acharya Nagarjuna's dialectics, to Aryabhata's mathematics, to the multivocal debates in the Upanishads, if you look at all of this, all of these different things, it's precisely that they were never closed systems that didn't interact with each other. They argued, they dissented. As I said, they tried to convince another through the power of argument. They traveled, they absorbed, they transformed. A mature civilization does not have historical amnesia, of course, but nor does it engage in uncritical glorification of your own past. It studies the past with that very, a sense of confidence, humility, and also methodological rigor. And the third part is also very important, and that is where historians, researchers, institutions have a very important duty to play, because just slogans cannot support the quest for indigenous knowledge systems. Archival work, field research, linguistic skills, textual analysis, ethnographic engagement, a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration, all of this are very much necessary, and we need scholars who are comfortable traversing between manuscripts and modern laboratories, between oral traditions and digital archives, between classical languages and contemporary policy frameworks. We are inheritors of a glorious tradition, but we are also living in a modern world, and the twain have to meet if either of it has to survive. Only then can we turn civilizational memory into actual actionable knowledge. And of course, I'd like to also add that at FIHCR we do precisely this. We're looking at interdisciplinary work, we're looking at evidence-based research, the use of technology, which is not anathema to any of it, and how do we bridge this gap between the past and the present. And we must also remember another interesting aspect here. You see, the Silk Road, it was not just a trade route for silk and spices and all that. It was actually a highway, a kind of an artery for ideas. Buddhism reached China through this. Greek astronomical models entered the Siddhantic tradition. They were reformulated. The Arab algebraists, they took a lot of the Indian Hindu numeral systems and preserved and extended it. So epistemic traditions, when they are alive and confident, they are promiscuous. they don't mind crossovers, multiple bed partners. They borrow without shame, because they borrow from a position of strength, not one of anxiety. And that's exactly what we need to cultivate today. This whole, we are under threat and so on. As I said, I understand where that comes from, because we are at a vulnerable space of our civilizational knowledge. But the very fact that it survived for so long should give us the strength, the confidence that it can certainly do better, considering at least people like all of us are thinking about it. Now, what colonialism did was not to expose us to foreign ideas. That had always happened. I think what it did was to make us ashamed of our own. It created what the Peruvian sociologist Quijano called the coloniality of being. Coloniality of being. a psychic wound in which the colonized subject internalizes the colonizer's attempts and actually begins to experience their own traditions as being inferior, their own languages and scripts as being inadequate, and looks at their own past as deeply embarrassing and problematic. So epistemic disobedience, which this symposium talks about, is not about building walls around yourself. It is about restoring the confidence to stand on our own ground even as we engage the world. I think Sri Aurobindo had this beautiful poem called The Tree, which said, "Earth-bound, heaven amorous." Right? It is the difference between a conversation between equals and a student-teacher relationship, which is permanently cast as the subordinate. And one of the most promising areas in this direction is ecological knowledge. Long before the rise of modern environmental science and climate change and all of this, communities throughout India developed very complex systems to manage water, forests, agriculture, biodiversity. And I think the first one step that a lot of pre-colonial societies did was to give, make this into a kind of a divine entity where you are actually spiritualizing the entire content. And so mountains are sacred, river is sacred, every animal is the vehicle of some god or goddess. And so in the process, you're protecting all of them. You're showing that reverence to nature, which is exactly the problems that modern societies are grappling with, right? Traditional water harvesting structures, community managed commons, seed preservation practices, sacred ecological landscapes, all of this indicate a very, very sophisticated understanding of what today the buzzword sustainability is. Now, these systems were not the product of some abstract theory, but of generations of lived experience. So such traditions are worth studying closely at the time when the world and humankind is battling climate uncertainty, ecological destruction, resource stress, not because they are old, but because they may be very relevant to present problems. I come from the city of Bangalore, where every monsoon we have the roads flooded in it. My city makes it to the news for all the wrong reasons. But the founder of my city, this man in the 16th century called Kempegowda, he had devised such a beautiful system of lakes. Bangalore was called the city of lakes, where between one lake to the other there were these ducts which carried excess water. So every time it rained more in one part, the mountainous terrain would ensure that the water flowed from the region of higher density of water to the lower density through these ducts. And so the city never overflooded. But today what's happened is all these lake beds have been reclaimed, and on that apartments have come up. But where does the water go? The water will find its path where it finds a path. So it ends up flooding costly apartments and the streets and IT companies and so on. But then the entire idea of town planning, urban planning, which again, right from the Sindhu Saraswati times, we have had an idea about it, sadly doesn't find any resonance in policy discussions today of town planning. We're talking of India 2047 and all of that, but are we looking at some of these ancient methodologies of urban planning? I think that's an area waiting to be explored. Likewise, I think the symposiums I went through the contents of it. Its emphasis on Adivasi epistemologies, I think, is particularly significant. Indigenous communities have been studied almost as museum pieces, objects of anthropology, right? With which you look and with amazement, like the Aborigines of Australia or so, rather than as producers of knowledge. Their understanding of landscape, of ecology, of kinship, of community, they often embody intellectual frameworks that challenge all the dominant assumptions about development and human nature, animal-human relationships. And listening to their voices is not some act of charity that we are doing on them. It's an act of intellectual justice where we are, I think, benefited more. Indeed, the future of knowledge production in India must be inclusive. It must recognize that wisdom has emerged from multiple locations: classical, vernacular, tribal, rural, urban, textual, oral, every kind. And another crucial dimension of this conversation concerns language. Now, language is not just a medium of communication. It is a medium of cognition, and it is also a marker of culture, a marker of memory. That's why it's called a mother tongue. It connects you up through the umbilical cord to your mother, to the flavor of the soil that you come from. And every language has within it very, very unique categories, metaphors, and ways of perceiving reality. So when a language dies, an entire intellectual universe, an entire cultural experience also dies with it. And India's linguistic diversity is, I think, one of its greatest civilizational strengths. Though today, in today's days of politics, one language is fought against the other, but if you look at it, our strength has been this. So Sanskrit, Tamil, Kannada, Assamese, Bengali, Marathi, Odia, Telugu, Malayalam, Kashmiri, Punjabi, Gujarati, countless other languages, innumerable dialects. They've generated very rich traditions of philosophy, of literature, of science, and social thought. The challenge before us today is not to reject English. English has become an important global language, and it remains a valuable instrument of communication and of scholarship internationally. And so that is a take given, and considering someone like me, a Macaulay Putra, who writes in English, who thinks and even dreams in English. But the challenge, I think, is to ensure that English does not become the only gateway to intellectual legitimacy. I think a truly decolonized knowledge system is one in which ideas can originate even in Indian languages and still command academic respect. The future of Indian scholarship must definitely therefore be multilingual. And here I would also like to draw all your attention to the kind of technological advancements that are happening around us today. And I think that's worth thinking about, because in addition to being a historian and someone who's running the Foundation for Indian Historical and Cultural Research, I also am deeply embedded into the technology world as a co-founder of a AI company called Nav AI, which is navigating AI across vocabularies, where we're using AI for translation of long form content from one language to the other, especially English to Indian languages. Now here too, I mean, it is a area that constantly bothers me, and you're the right audience to share this bother with. As a historian who sees patterns, the way things are going around in the artificial intelligence world today, I think it is an East India Company version 2.0 happening today. And it's not a matter of a rhetoric or a joke, but I think it's the reality. Now, you have these Western companies, and I have nothing against them. We also use their models, whether it is Claude or Gemini or GPT or whoever else. They are coming to India, and these vast data sets of our languages, large language models, LLMs, function on what? On large quantities of data, which is what helps you build a foundational LLM. Now, this entire data of words, of vocabulary, of regional nuances, dialects, voice, how does a particular language sound, all of this is being done by them. And 50 to 100 years later, when our grandchildren or their children are in this country, Gemini is going to probably decide what good Hindi is. Someone else is going to tell you what your language, how it should be written or pronounced, or how does some language sound, some regional dialect. Isn't that a matter of shame that we've not actually integrated in any of the sovereign LLM models that India has built? We haven't even integrated Sanskrit into it. The mother of all these languages of India. If you fix that, probably so much of Indian language systems could be fixed. But we have not done that. We do window dressing around it. Just imagine a Hindi that is spoken in Rajasthan in one district is so different from Rajasthan, other district. Mewar and Marwar are probably different. Bhojpuri, Maithili, variants of Hindi would be different. Awadhi and the whole thing in UP, Madhya Pradesh. Where are we gathering data sets for all of this? Can't this become a national project where we send millions of people to the ground, ask villagers, ask people in different parts of the country to just record something, in their language, so that you're storing that for posterity. In Karnataka, southern Karnataka has a kind of Kannada, North Karnataka has a different, rhythm to it. Coastal Karnataka is different. There are unscripted languages like Tulu and Konkani and Byari and all of these, which are at the verge of being gobbled up. So today, especially when there is an influx of modern technology, you can't fight it. You have to survive it. Can you use that to be your ally and particularly work towards the preservation of language? I leave that as a question for the audience of this symposium to deeply ponder about, because as I said, language is that umbilical cord which connects us to our past, our culture, our present and our future also. Equally important is the question of curriculum. What should future generations learn about India? Are they only to see Indian knowledge systems as historical curiosities, museum pieces which you have to exoticize and romanticize, or are they to engage with them as living traditions that have a contribution to make to contemporary debates, to contemporary issues that we have? And here the answer does not lie in replacing one orthodoxy with another, but in expanding, I think, the intellectual horizons itself that is available to students. And I want to say something now about the young scholars who are part of this symposium, because I believe the future of this project rests on your shoulders more than mine or some of the other older folks here. You inhabit a peculiar and privileged moment. Institutional frameworks are slowly shifting. The new education policy, whatever its limitations, whatever, however uneven its method of implementation is, I won't get into that, has at least opened the door to the legitimacy of IKS in the formal curriculum. Digital technology has democratized access to archives that were once available to only those with connections and resources to travel to London or Washington or somewhere else. So there is genuinely a moment of possibility here for all of you. But as I said earlier, the dangers are also real, and that danger has two faces. The first is this phase of uncritical romanticism. The past of Bharat was not uniformly glorious. It had within it oppression and social evils like all societies. Neither one should feel terribly ashamed and embarrassed about it all the time. Neither should you say that was all a Western conspiracy. There is a lot of truth also in some of this. So epistemic disobedience, if it is to be honest, it must also be disobedient towards the internal realities of the Bharatiya tradition. And a truly decolonized epistemology is not one that replaces one hierarchy with another. It is one that insists, as I said earlier, on the plural, on the marginal, on the suppressed across all traditions and bring them under one larger umbrella. The other danger, I think, is the face of academic dilettantism. The recovery of IKS cannot be a shortcut to avoiding rigor. It cannot mean that we simply assert, the greatness of ancient Indian science without the hard work of actually reading the texts, learning those languages, engaging with the primary sources, which, in FIHCR, that is the bedrock of our thing. Go to the primary sources in their original. That defines all our research. The Sulabha Sutras deserve to be studied with the same rigor that we apply to, say, Euclid. Charakas, Shushrutas, Samhitas, they deserve the same methodological seriousness as, say, Gelun or Hippocrates. The challenge is not to lower the bar of evidence. The modern, tools of epistemology, of evidence and adjudication that has to apply and to that bar consistently to all traditions without the double standard that has historically privileged Western sources as primary and Indian sources as somehow secondary. After all, epistemic disobedience is not epistemic laziness. I think it should give you epistemic confidence. Education should cultivate critical inquiry, not ideological conformity and homogenization, as I said. Students should be encouraged to take indigenous traditions seriously, assess their strengths and limitations, compare them with global frameworks, and arrive at their own independent conclusions. A confident civilization does not fear scrutiny, it welcomes it. The objective is therefore not intellectual isolation but intellectual dialogue. The seminar concept note also speaks of creating an inter-epistemic dialogue. I find this formulation particularly very compelling because for far too long, discussions about knowledge have been structured through hierarchies: modern versus traditional, scientific versus indigenous, rational versus spiritual. Such binaries, I think, can be very misleading. Human knowledge has always developed through interaction, adaptation, and exchange, and the future need not be a choice between indigenous knowledge systems and modern science. The future can be a space where multiple traditions actually engage one another as equals, where empirical methods and local experiences, they actually complement each other, where technological innovation meets ecological wisdom, where historical memory actually shapes contemporary policy making, and where Bharat contributes not just data but actually ideas to global conversations. I think this aspiration is of profound importance in 21st century Bharat. The title of this seminar reminds us that India is Bharat. This statement should not be understood merely as a matter of nomenclature or a slogan. I think it's an invitation to recover civilizational self-awareness, to say that it's not a political rhetoric, though politics has colonized it. It is an epistemological claim. It says the self-understanding of this vast, great civilization does not begin with the colonial encounter. It does not begin, say, 1857 or 1947 or 50 when the constitution came, or with the Mughal court. None of it. It begins with the rivers and the forests, the sages and the singers and the savants and farmers and weavers who preceded all of that, and whose knowledge, however imperfectly recorded, transmitted, however partially surviving, is still alive, thankfully, in this land. The historian's task, the scholar's task, all of us, that all of you have gathered here to pursue, is to listen to that living archive with the same rigor, the same care, the same respect that we would bring to any other primary source. Not to romanticize it, not to politicize it, but to hear it honestly, on its own terms. I think that is the beginning of real epistemic disobedience. That is the beginning of the work that we could do together. To reclaim Bharat, therefore, is not to reject the world. It is to engage the world from a position of intellectual confidence rather than as, dependency. As scholars and as citizens, our task is not only to conserve the knowledge handed down to us, but to renew that. The responsibility before us is immense, ladies and gentlemen, but I think it is also very, very exciting. Perhaps the most important question facing India today is not whether we possess knowledge traditions worthy of study. The evidence of history answers that question directly and very decisively. The real question is whether we possess the imagination, the discipline, the courage to bring those traditions into meaningful conversations with our present and the future. And I believe we do. And seminars such as this represent a very important step in that direction. I heartily congratulate the Department of English at the Gurucharan University for organizing this very, very timely and necessary dialogue. And I'm very honored that you invited me to deliver this keynote address on the inaugural of this important symposium. And I hope that the deliberations over the next 3 days can challenge assumptions, prompt reflections, promote collaborations between various fields, and inspire new avenues of research. Let us undertake this task with curiosity and not certainty, because that's again against the Bharatiya tradition to be certain about something. With rigor, not just with rhetoric, and with confidence and not insecurity. And as knowledge partners, the Foundation for Indian Historical and Cultural Research, FIHCR, is very happy to work with the university, with other scholars, to see and scope interesting, important projects which also link the historical understanding, the cultural understanding that could come out of this symposium. The quest of knowledge has always been one of the greatest civilizational journeys of Bharat, and let us keep that journey alive and going. With these words, I'd like to thank you all for a very patient hearing on a Monday morning on this important symposium, and thank you once again for inviting me and FIHCR to be a part of this very important symposium. Thank you. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.